In the summer of 1942, a Marine Corps pilot named Captain William Humbird sat down and wrote an official report that should have ended corporate careers. Humbird had flown the Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo at Midway with VMF 221. He came back. Most of his squadron did not. His report did not blame the Japanese. It blamed the airplane. Specifically, he wrote that the Buffalo was not a combat airplane and that sending pilots into battle in one was nothing short of murder. That word, murder, filed in an official military document is exactly the kind of detail that bureaucratic systems are built to quietly absorb. For decades after Midway, the disaster was attributed to the pilots being outclassed. The Zero was faster, more nimble, and more capable. That is a clean explanation. It fits on a plaque. Here's what does not fit on a plaque. Some of the Buffaloes that went down at Midway had rivets in the airframe that were never properly set. Control cables were frayed before the planes left the factory. Structural panels had been painted over to hide defects that Navy inspectors had already rejected. Those men were not just outflown. They were flying machines that had been compromised long before they ever reached the Pacific. Signed off by a company that was running something close to a fraud operation. How does a corporation hand the United States Navy a crate of defective fighters, accept a government check, and get away with it long enough to cost men their lives? That is what this episode is all about.
You're watching World War II Air Command.
To understand where the Buffalo was actually built, forget the image of a modern aerospace facility. There were no clean rooms, no climate control, no rows of precision instruments. The Brewster Aeronautical Plant in Long Island City, New York was a converted 5-story shoe factory. Old freight elevators groaned under aluminum components. Finished fuselage sections were hoisted out of upper floor windows by crane and loaded onto flatbed trucks for the drive to an airfield miles away. That setup alone should have raised alarms with anyone watching the operation closely. Brewster had won simultaneous contracts from the U.S. Navy, the British Royal Air Force, and the Dutch East Indies government. On paper, that made the company look like an industrial force. In reality, given the size of the facility and the state of their workforce, they had overpromised to all 3 customers at once with no credible path to delivering on any of it. The labor situation made everything worse. Local union leadership was openly adversarial toward management, frequently calling slowdowns for political leverage rather than legitimate grievances. Minor floor disputes that a foreman should have resolved in 20 minutes routinely turned into lost production days. The executive nominally in charge of all of this was a man named James Work. Work had a particular talent for making financial statements look healthy while the physical operation fell apart around him. He collected substantial personal bonuses while the company fell months behind on every delivery commitment it had made. FBI agents began walking the plant floor in plain clothes. What they documented went beyond negligence. Tools vanished in patterns that did not match accident. Technical blueprints were subtly altered in ways that could survive a casual inspection. The young Navy officers assigned to quality check, the outgoing aircraft were understaffed and fighting a losing battle against a factory that had decided the paperwork mattered more than what the paperwork described. One Navy lieutenant assigned to the Brewster plant in 1941 described his job as opening Christmas presents you already knew were broken. Armed with a flashlight, a clipboard, and a micrometer, he was responsible for inspecting finished F-2A3 airframes before the fleet would accept them. Beneath the clean coats of non-specular sea blue paint, what he found was hard to rationalize as honest workmanship. Rivets sat loose in their holes, held by friction and primer and nothing structural. Aluminum skin panels had missed their heat treatment cycles, leaving the metal soft in ways that would not reveal themselves until a pilot pulled hard through a combat turn. Control cables connecting the stick to the tail surfaces were found routed backward through their pulleys on multiple occasions, a configuration that guaranteed a jam after a few hours of flight. When inspectors flagged these problems on the F-2A3 production line, Brewster management did not stop the process to identify the root cause. They used political connections in Washington to pressure the Navy into easing the inspection criteria. The argument was framed around urgency. Strict inspections were slowing wartime production, and every day of delay had a cost. The Navy, facing real pressure from all directions, sometimes backed down. The planes kept rolling out. Fleet pilots who complained that their Buffaloes felt wrong, that trim tabs locked up in a dive, or that control response was heavier than the flight manual described, were not imagining things. They were experiencing the physical result of decisions made in a converted shoe factory by people who were never going to be in that cockpit. Captain Humbird's report was written from the other side of all of those decisions. His language was flat, precise, and without any apparent interest in diplomatic phrasing. By the spring of 1942, the situation had moved beyond what paperwork could fix. The Pacific War was escalating rapidly. Brewster's production output had dropped sharply. Quality metrics were deteriorating at the exact moment the United States needed them moving in the opposite direction. Roosevelt reviewed the intelligence picture and made a decision. The United States government seized the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation by executive order. Navy authorities arrived at the Long Island City plant. James Work and his team were removed from authority. A Navy captain was installed as direct operational head of the facility, effectively converting a private American business into a federal operation without a transition period. It was a nearly unprecedented action in American wartime industry. The conclusion reached at the highest levels of government was that the standard mechanisms of contract enforcement and corporate accountability had failed completely, and that there was no remaining option short of taking direct control. For the men of VMF 221, it came too late to matter. The F-2A-3 aircraft built during the worst period of the factory's dysfunction had already been crated, shipped, and were crossing the Pacific toward a coral atoll called Midway. Captain Humbard's post-battle report was not widely distributed. The Navy had practical reasons to manage the information carefully, while other defense contracts were still active and other manufacturers still needed to be kept cooperative. A loose rivet does not fail on the ground. It holds through taxi, through takeoff, through the first hour of a patrol flight. It gives way when the load demands something it was never properly secured to provide, in a hard brake turn or a steep dive. Precisely when a pilot cannot afford to find out, Brewster handed the Navy paperwork that described a combat fighter. The men who climbed into those cockpits at Midway were the ones who found out what the paperwork had actually described. Military history tends to organize itself around tactics, aircraft performance numbers, and engagement outcomes. That framing is useful, and it is often true as far as it goes. This part of the story, the converted shoe factory, the falsified inspection records, the government forced to seize a corporation by executive order to stop the production of defective aircraft, does not organize neatly. It sits differently. It should. In the next episode, we move to a completely different theater. While the American F-2A-3 was failing in the Pacific, a small batch of earlier export B-239 models had reached Finland. Operating with fewer resources, worse supply lines, and a fraction of the support infrastructure, the Finnish Air Force took the same basic airframe and produced results that no one in Washington or London had predicted.